The year is 2015, and we're near a somewhat famous archaeological site in Ukraine. There we're joining a man named John Chapman. Now he's a researcher from Durham University, and he's there along with a bunch of others, part of a multidisciplinary team and a multinational team that have been working together now for some time on a very unique and special joint project. These researchers and archaeologists have combined their forces together to build not one but two replicas of ancient Cucuteni Trypillia structures. Now, the Cucuteni Trypillia people were a culture that flourished in ancient Europe, in Neolithic Europe. And even though they don't have maybe the name drop recognition of the ancient Egyptians, say, they are hugely important and only in recent years starting to get really the attention here in the West that they deserve. Existing in Europe roughly between 5500 BC to 2750 BC, and spreading across the lands today we would think of as Romania, Moldova, and Ukraine. This culture was absolutely groundbreaking. They made beautiful pottery and figurines and jewelry, built huge monumental structures, some 2 stories tall, some as big as 2 basketball courts, making literally what may have been the largest buildings in the world at that time. And hundreds of years before the earliest cities of ancient Sumer in Mesopotamia, the Cucuteni Trypillia people were forming mega settlements, literally early proto-cities, but not cities like we would know them today. And in fact, now we get finally to the reason why our friend John Chapman and these researchers and archaeologists and anthropologists and everyone else have come together. Because not only was this an incredibly ingenious, brilliant, beautiful ancient culture, that they are also one of the most mysterious groups of people from our past for many reasons, from their settlement layout to the organization of their society, and perhaps most importantly, their homes. Their homes are kind of a mystery to us, and that's why John Chapman and that whole team are there. They're building Cucuteni Trypillia houses. They're not trying to rebuild a Cucuteni Trypillia temple, say. No, they're sticking to houses. And they put so much care into the building of these structures. They use the clay and wattle and daub techniques that these people themselves had used. They put some of the beautiful decorations that would have existed along the outside of these homes on their replicas. And inside of the homes, they didn't just make the layout the same, but they even took the time to put in what they called special objects or special items, replicas of artifacts taken from actual archaeological sites. So this wouldn't just look like a Cucuteni Trypillia house. They really tried to make this house, if you'll forgive me for using the phrase, feel like a home. Both of them, actually, I should say. And look at they're beautiful. They're absolutely beautiful. And after constructing these little structures, I can only imagine they must have taken time, or I hope they took the time, to stand back and look at what they've made here. The homes of an ancient people rising from the earth for the first time in thousands of years before them, right there. A truly glorious thing in itself. And now that they had completed this work of ancient architecture, this beautiful construction, it was time to begin the second phase of their project. Because the reason that the Cucuteni Trypillia culture has become more famous in recent years, and the reason that their homes are such a mystery to us, and in fact one of the main reasons that our team has taken the time to put together and build these homes in the first place, is to set them on fire. And that is what our friend John Chapman and his team proceeded to do. They stacked the houses that they had just so carefully built with all the wood they could get and lit them on fire. And then they stood back and they watched them burn. And they had a reason for doing that, because over 7,000 years ago, that seems to be exactly what the Cucuteni Trypillia people themselves actually did. And in fact, it wasn't just them. In a whole bunch of ancient cultures across Neolithic Europe, different people were building beautiful structures. And then after 60 to 80 years, a fire started by someone was burning them to the ground. Now, there was a lot of argument among archaeologists for years. Well, this had to be warfare or accidental or maybe even lightning strikes. But as time went on, those got to be ruled out. There was no evidence of widespread warfare, like weapons, bodies, things like that. And there's so many, that's a whole lot of accidents and lightning strikes. And so our friend John Chapman and others at this point had also built these replica homes, these beautiful replica ancient Cucuteni Trypillia homes, deliberately to set them on fire, to figure out what it takes to bring them down. And what John and everyone there found out that day was that it takes 10 times more wood to burn the house than it does to build the house. These fires were deliberate. These fires were not warfare. These fires were by the Cucuteni Trypillia people themselves. And in fact, it wasn't just them. All across ancient Europe, different cultures were building buildings, living in them for a while, and then apparently burning them down themselves, which just raises a whole bunch of questions. How did they build these mega sites? These huge proto-cities from Europe's ancient history before Sumer, before Egypt. And how could they build these beautiful, beautiful homes and then just torch them along with everything inside? And maybe most importantly of all, and I think the question that even our friend John was wondering as he stood there and watched that little house burn, is just, why? Hello, my name is Marie, and welcome to Lost Realms. Each episode we look at a different city, place, or people that have been lost to us, whether through the destruction of a disaster, the ravages of climatic changes, the failure of governments, or the cruelty of neighbors. Each one of these wonderful places or people were taken from us forever. The Cucuteni Trypillia culture was not the only ancient people to arise in Neolithic Europe. They weren't even the first. But our people, whose name comes from two excavation sites located in Romania and Ukraine, were some of the most fascinating and now, today, some of the most well-known, though we still have a lot to learn. We're going to look at their history in this region and the different cultures that influence them. We're going to cover what we know of their society, their art and culture, their spiritual beliefs, and look at what we know and what we can guess about their motivations and why they may have created this mysterious so-called burned house horizon. Now, before we dive into today's story, I will say that this is a topic that is currently still being studied heavily by anthropologists and archaeologists around the world. Literally, just this last week, a new news article came out about a recent discovery that I actually did a short about here on my channel. Because of this, I really want to make it clear going in that my full source list, just like always, can be found pinned to the top comment below. And I'm not even sure if I've said it in a video here before, but I do update the sources, guys, whenever I come across something new in my research. So if you have an interest in our topic, please be sure to check that out below. And all that being said, let's dive in. The landscape of Neolithic Europe would be both familiar to the modern person and also incredibly different. This was a time, obviously, before modern nation-states existed, even as a concept. But that doesn't mean that ancient Europe wasn't home to many different cultures and people. Perhaps the most famous of these are the different linear pottery culture tribes that existed across ancient Europe. They were all united by similar types of tool use and pottery, as the name suggests, and artwork, and they flourished across this region for well over 1,000 years. They would have a profound impact on all the successive cultures that came after them, including the Cucuteni Trypillia people, and would also leave behind some intriguing mysteries of their own. And following the decline of the linear pottery culture, the Cucuteni would rise to prominence and soon begin displaying what archaeologists have described as the earliest known signs of urbanization anywhere in human history. But it's not just their huge settlements, which we'll get back to, that draw notice. These people cultivated wheat, legumes, and barley. They made beautiful, colorful clay pottery in fired kilns, beautiful spiritual figurines that still mystify us today. All of this, as you can see here, can take the form of beautiful shapes and be covered in amazing patterns. Oftentimes the shapes of different pottery vessels can be evocative of the female figure, and a majority of figurines recovered from different Cucuteni Trypillia sites seem to be based around showing the female figure, whether these represent goddesses or priestesses or whatever. And some of them are just truly breathtaking. They also developed the use of copper. crafting copper axes as well as using it in jewelry. And if we go back to those copper axes for a second, that does give me a nice segue into talking about their buildings and how they constructed these things. But first, let's look at their settlements as a whole. All Cucuteni Trypillia settlements, like major ones yet found, seem to follow a very similar pattern. First, a very large area would be cordoned off, separated off from the rest of the land by digging trenches. And I want to make it clear, actually, these large settlements that they built were planned. They did set aside a large encircled space right from the start, and then from the center in seemed to build outwards in their homes and other buildings. So there always seems to have been a large open part in the center, maybe used for cattle or for other livestock, because they were raising cows, sheep, goats. As I said, they were incredibly advanced, and please keep in mind all of this is starting well over 7,000 years ago. Hundreds of years before the rise of ancient Sumer, these people were building settlements in this fashion that were as large as any of the ancient Sumerian city-states. The homes within these settlements, or proto-cities, were laid out in distinct neighborhoods. There were concentrically circling streets, planned roads going outwards throughout this settlement. And some of the buildings within it, like I said, are incredibly impressive. Some comprising multiple stories, built using clay reinforced with wooden frameworks, making a sturdy home that could then be beautifully decorated. But again, not just homes. Perhaps the most impressive building that archaeologists have found evidence of is what's known as the Neolithic Temple. Now you can see a picture of an artist's reconstruction of what it probably looked like here. As you can see, it's just massive. This would have been part of the Neolithic ancient settlement, dating to around 4000 BC, covering an area of 260 to 300 hectares, and was maybe home to as many as 17,000 people just at this one settlement. And our temple was a 2-story structure, which included a galleried courtyard. The building itself was 60 meters long and 20 meters high, and artifacts found from within the remains of it include those beautiful figurines that I mentioned to you, as well as pottery, charred animal bones, and golden fragments belonging to various ornaments or maybe jewelry. Now, unfortunately, because these weren't built in sort of the arid region of some of the more deserty cultures like Egypt or Mesopotamia, honestly, even if they hadn't been setting these buildings on fire, they probably wouldn't have survived down to our time anyway, but that doesn't change how impressive they were. And we haven't even talked yet about their technological innovations, which for the time were huge. We know they had weaving, even though none of their textiles survived. We found loom weights, so they were using looms. We know they had the wheel by this point, which would have made them hugely mobile. And in fact, some of these mega settlements were believed to have been temporary residences, or only lived in for part of the year. And that's why different archaeologists keep sort of using different terms for these places, just like I have been. You know, sometimes it's a settlement, sometimes it's a proto-city. But I think if you or I were to be dropped into one and to look around it, I think we would at least recognize it as a town of some kind, you know, some kind of urban settlement. But this is where things get really, really interesting. Because though we found the remains of lots of different settlements from them, actually over 5,000 different Cucuteni Trypillia settlements have been found, we have found almost no burials from them whatsoever. And as macabre as it may sound, it's from archaeologists excavating the burials of different ancient cultures that we learn a lot from them. And this has led to us still having a lot of questions about how their society was structured and also what their religious practices looked like. And both of these things are important if we're ever going to try to understand what led to that burned house horizon, what led to them burning all these beautiful buildings down eventually. But one thing that could be helpful and that has really stood out to modern day researchers is the lack of any sort of class structure that we found evidenced in the Cucuteni Trypillia remains. There doesn't seem to be people with bigger houses or smaller houses than the other. No one seems to be setting fire to the house more than anyone else. There's little evidence of violence or anything like that in Cucuteni society, and we've certainly found no great burial mounds of kings or anything like that. This has led most modern anthropologists and historians to consider our ancient people to be an evidence of an ancient pre-class society, which, if so, is absolutely fascinating, because the idea that there isn't really a cohesive leadership or class structure, that these huge settlements, these huge amounts of people are managing to still live together and somehow work together. It's really challenging the ideas that we have of how people live and how our urbanized and governmental structures can look. But where does all this leave us with our house burning? Let's take a second to go through what we know, and let's look at the different theories that have been put forward as what could have been happening here. As I mentioned during the introduction, it's now considered almost common knowledge that the Cucuteni Trypillia people were burning down their houses themselves, but it wasn't always this way. Obviously, in modern times, unless we're up to something shady, we don't normally set fire to our own homes. So when archaeologists first began to uncover these layers of burning, especially over and over again, it really gave them pause. And perhaps understandably, researchers' first thought upon encountering these layers of ash and soot was warfare. But the thing is, we have an idea, a pretty good one, of what Neolithic warfare can look like, unfortunately. In fact, even earlier than the Cucuteni people, way back with that linear pottery culture I mentioned, they have left us behind some very horrifying and very mysterious evidence of human violence and warfare. Perhaps the most extreme example of this would be at Herxheim, which is something I'm going to be getting to in a future episode. But basically, we have, unfortunately, especially in recent years, plenty of evidence what people killing each other or hurting each other in the ancient world looked like. But at the Cucuteni sites, there's almost none of that. There's no arrowheads, there's no swords or axes, there's no bodies being laid around with injuries all over them. There's nothing like that. And in fact, in the burned homes, there's almost never any human remains found at all. This meant that warfare, except at a very few sites, could be ruled out. And again, we're talking about a large region and a large amount of burning over and over and over again, layers of burning. So that's way outside the realm of any accident or lightning strike. Some have put forth the idea that they weren't destroying these structures, but were instead reinforcing them. According to one archaeologist, perhaps the heat of the fire, instead of actually destroying the homes, would have reinforced that clay that was used to build them, turning them into a type of ceramic. But the thing is, we found evidence where they rebuilt their homes using the rubble from the earlier ones, so they were absolutely being destroyed. What about movement? After all, some have put forward the idea that these mega settlements weren't lived in year-round. Maybe they were destroying these houses so they could just build somewhere else, or they needed the space for something different. But in many instances, like I said, it's layer on layer, so they would burn down the house and then rebuild the house exactly where it had been before. That doesn't really seem to fit in with the whole needing space thing. In a completely different vein of thought, in recent years, I mentioned the plague tea before. Well, that was very literal. Some remains, scattered remains, have been found with plague bacteria in them. But it's very minimal, and a lot more of the remains found, which like I said, are minimal, so take this all with a grain of salt. But more remains have been found, I guess I'm getting at, without plague than with plague. So it doesn't really seem like something that would be likely. And if there was a big plague going on, if they're smart enough to know they need to get rid of germs in the home, then they're probably going to be getting rid of the bodies in the home too. But like I said, we almost never find human remains in these burned houses. So why aren't they burning the bodies with the houses if the bodies have plague? It's a nice idea, but it doesn't make sense in the practice and what we're seeing in the field. And now we're almost running out of ideas. We've ruled out warfare. We've ruled out accident. We've ruled out fumigation. We've ruled out fire being a help and not a hurt. The most common theory that archaeologists and anthropologists are going with now is the domicide theory, or specifically in our instance, spiritual domicide. So they're destroying their own homes for a spiritual purpose, a sense of completion. Now, we don't really know yet what that completion might represent or be for. We don't know why the 60 to 80 year time period. But by process of elimination, and due to the fact that they have found different figurines that seem to be of a spiritual nature in some of these burned homes, they think it might be part of a religious ritual. Now again, because so much of their spiritual beliefs are still a mystery to us, it's hard to even formulate a workable theory as to what was the thought process behind this. I admit, as I think of this, the first thing that comes to mind is how sometimes when a ship has neared the end of its life after it's been sailing for years and it's had a good run, sometimes they'll deliberately sink it, not to do something shady or out of spite, but like to give it rest. I've even heard of people doing a little ceremony around it, and sometimes now they'll deliberately sink ships to turn them into coral reefs. I don't know, that's kind of the first thing that comes to mind. And I'm not trying to make a correlation there. I just mean from my own limited modern perspective, when we talk about the symbolic ending of structures, that's sort of the tone that this gives to me. Because again, there's no real evidence of violence. And sometimes they'd rebuild right on top. So I have to assume that they were doing okay. And I think that's beautiful in a way. I think we all have different objects or things that we love. And sometimes that can be a bad thing. But, I'm thinking more of along the lines of like a beloved teddy bear for a child. Or maybe, a sports jersey that your dad gives you and you cling to and means a lot. It makes you think of not just the team, but of him. We all have material objects that have emotional meaning to us. And if you're the kind of person that's lucky enough to have a family home, oh my goodness, yes, that's absolutely so meaningful. It can be so meaningful for a family. And we've even heard sort of kind of the opposite thing. I think we can all think of horror movies where the house is alive, but it's evil, and it's just the house was born bad. Isn't that the house on Haunted Hill? Isn't that the whole thing of that one? Do you guys remember that one? The idea of an object taking on a greater spiritual meaning than the sum of its parts is a very human one. And I also think that the idea of a home being more than just a collection of floorboards is also pretty universal and really relatable. And actually, that's, as I get to the end of the episode here, that's just what I keep thinking is, yeah, these guys were alive 7,000 years ago, but their towns, their lives, their art, their culture, their really clear, strong feelings about their homes and their families. I do feel kind of like I know them. I feel close to them, as mysterious as they still are. And I am just so excited to hopefully learn even more about them in the future. And that means it's about the end of my time here and the end of our story. And thank you so much for being here for the story of the Burned House Horizon. Whenever we dive into the crazy world of our past, we can see things that confuse us or upset us or even just leave us wanting more. But if we're feeling anything about our past, and I think that means that it matters to us. And I think that that's beautiful. And when I said thank you a second ago, I hope that it wasn't just for your views, but for your compassion, your empathy, and your humanity. Because if you have an interest in our human history, then it means that you do have all these qualities, and I'm very happy that you do. If you find yourself particularly interested in the Cucuteni Trypillia people, then please don't let my words be the last words you hear on the topic. Like I said, you'll find a full source list below, but don't stop there. And may I say that your local library might have a book on Neolithic Europe. You never know. You never know until you check. You can go to the library and find a bunch of cool books. It's a bunch of cool books about a whole bunch of cool stuff. Okay, it might not end up being about Neolithic Europe, but you're bound to find something. It's literally a building full of awesome, awesome books. You're bound to find something. Just go to the library. And once you're back from the library, keep an eye out for Lost Bits. Lost Bits is a show that I do every Saturday here on my channel, and it's a bit more informal, and it's a place for me to answer your questions and to share cool bits of information I find when making these main episodes, and it's also just a place for me to get to know you better. So if you have anything that you'd like addressed in Lost Bits, then please let me know in the comments below. Or if you have any episode suggestions or just anything, I always love to hear from you. So keep an eye out for that if you'd like to. And if you're new here, you should know that I release new main episode videos like this every single Monday. So if you like what you saw, then please consider subscribing so you don't miss anything. But either way, thank you again for being here. Be safe, be happy, go with all my love. Until next time, goodbye.